This is Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Carrie Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Massachusetts. And this is a podcast that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. On January 7th, 2023, in Memphis, Tennessee, a 29-year-old Black man named Tyre Nichols was driving home from his job at FedEx. Tyre was 2 minutes away from his house when he was pulled over by the police for an unsubstantiated claim of reckless driving. Tyre explained that he was trying to get home. For unclear reasons, officers tried to detain him. They threatened him, swore at him, and held him to the ground and used a stun gun. Tyre tried to run away. The police called for backup. He was 60 to 90 yards away from his mother's house when he was detained again and sprayed in the face. For about 3 minutes, multiple police officers hit, kicked, and punched him in the head and body, including with the use of a baton. Tyre called out for his mother. He asked the officers, "What did I do?" There is no indication that the officers ever explained the reason that he was being detained or beaten. The degree of aggression used by the police officers is inexplicable. The New York Times assessed that Tyre was given 71 commands in 13 minutes, many of which were, quote, confusing, conflicting, and impossible to obey, end of quote. For example, he was asked to show them his hands while they were holding his hands. He was asked to get on the ground when he was already on the ground. And even when he managed to obey, he was still treated with brutal force. He was eventually left slumped on the ground with no aid being rendered. When the paramedics finally arrived, it is reported that for unclear reasons, they did not render aid for an additional 16 minutes. When the ambulance arrived and he was placed on a stretcher, it was reported that he remained there for an additional 24 minutes before being transported to the hospital. Tyre reported shortness of breath. 3 days later, on January 10, Tyre Nichols died as a result of the severe injuries he sustained. An independent autopsy later showed extensive bleeding caused by a severe beating. 10 days later, on January 20th, the 5 police officers involved in the incident were fired from the Memphis Police Department when it was determined that they violated multiple department policies. 6 days later, on January 26, a grand jury indicted the 5 officers and charged each of them with second-degree murder, aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping resulting in bodily injury, aggravated kidnapping involving the possession of a weapon, official misconduct through unauthorized exercise of power, official misconduct through failure to act when there's a duty imposed by law, and official oppression. In President Biden's statement, he said, "Like so many, I was outraged and deeply pained to see the horrific video of the beating that resulted in Tyre Nichols' death. It is yet another painful reminder of the profound fear and trauma, the pain, and the exhaustion that Black and Brown Americans experience every single day." Today, for my podcast on Black mental health, I asked a question: where can you feel safe as a Black American? Where can you experience a psychological sense of safety? I want to talk about a few things today. One is trauma, particularly a phenomenon known as vicarious trauma, which I'll define in just a second. The second is about empathy and the lack thereof. And the third is about race. So I'll start with the first. Following the release of this gruesome video, you will no doubt have seen many posts on social media from mental health influencers talking about whether or not you should watch the video. I decided not to watch after reading the written description of what happened. I would echo what others have said, which is that you don't have to make yourself watch this video. But I do think you should read the news stories that explained what happened. I think you should be informed. What happened is very saddening. It's very shocking. It's very concerning. It's heartbreaking. And it makes us angry. For those of us in the Black community, we look at the picture of Tyre Nichols and we see our own family members and our own friends reflected back in his face. He looks just like a regular guy you might bump into at a coffee shop. He liked skateboarding and photography. If something like this can happen to an unarmed man, literally within walking distance from his home, then who is exempt? He was beaten even when he was complying, and even when he couldn't comply because he was already in a hold. Seeing this happen on video and reading about it as a Black person reduces our sense of safety in this world. This experience, even though we're distant from it physically, we're close to it emotionally. And that is where trauma comes in. You can still be traumatized, even if you're not physically in a situation. This is because the mind can travel, and so can the human heart. Through graphic videos and stories and words, our minds and our hearts draw us into the experience vicariously. It's as though we were there. It's as though this man were our brother, our friend, our uncle. We're distant physically, but it's close to our hearts. And that's vicarious trauma. We often don't realize that we're experiencing trauma vicariously, but trauma leaves traces. Trauma makes us hypervigilant of our surroundings. Trauma makes us more vigilant about the motives of other people. Trauma tells us to flee, like Tyre when threatened. Trauma makes us freeze up. It can sometimes make us prone to irritability, which can turn to agitation. Interestingly, trauma can also cause us to emotionally detach from other people, which I'll come back to. And in the case of you listeners, it's important to know that vicarious trauma can carry some of the same symptoms as depression: difficulty sleeping, headaches, changes in appetite, low motivation, poor concentration, fatigue. For the high achievers out there, symptoms of vicarious trauma can make you feel like you're failing, like you're not up to the job anymore, when in truth, you're going through a legitimate emotional process. This kind of event can make you fearful that the same thing is going to happen to you. That's what vicarious trauma does. It's one of the reasons why you shouldn't repeatedly watch the video or intensely follow the news. Whether or not you realize it, it is affecting you emotionally. The second thing that I want to talk about is empathy and the lack thereof. There was a podcast episode I did some time ago, and I spoke about the development of empathy in young children. And I can't remember now which episode it was. But today, I'm not going to go over the details of how children sometimes end up developing weaknesses in empathic connections. Because sometimes adults who can demonstrate empathy in some situations can also display a gross lack of empathy in other situations. One of the things that people have been talking about in internet spaces is something called dehumanization. If you can see someone as equally human, you can connect with them empathically. But if you see them as not equal in their humanity to you, then you risk seeing them partially as an object, and that emotional connection can become lost. It can happen to different degrees in different fields, not usually leading to brutality, of course, but to decisions that can reflect that detachment. But it's particularly deadly if you're in a field where you're armed and allowed to use force. That empathic detachment can put you at risk of going too far. How do you get to the point where you not only cross the line from only using force when necessary to using excessive force, but you also appear to relish the use of force, to be excited by it, to encourage your fellow officers to engage in it? Then, to walk around while a severely injured man is receiving no medical aid. In this case, I can speculate that it may not be the case that there was poor empathic development in childhood, but rather that in adulthood, they entered a position of authority and began to see others more as objects. There was dehumanization. And this is going to tie into the last thing that I wanted to touch on, which is race. Undoubtedly, you've heard a lot of discussion back and forth about the fact that the 5 police officers were Black and the victim was Black. My intention in this podcast episode is not to enter into that debate. The fact is that Black men in America are disproportionately treated with excessive force by law enforcement in America. Over and over in the arena of the law, Black men in America are not treated as equal in their humanity. They're seen as automatically more culpable than others, as more of a risk than others, as more suspicious than others. They're given longer sentences than others. They're over-policed and therefore cross paths with the legal system more frequently than others who may be doing the same things, but happen to belong to different communities. Their bodies are not perceived as having the same vulnerabilities or need for medical care. Even their very breath is seen as something that needs to be subdued. This was yet another Black man in legal custody who complained of difficulty breathing, and then eventually, in this case, 3 days later, stopped breathing altogether. So the main significance of race here is a victim, but many still wonder what it means that the officers were Black. I'm going to take a step back here and say I'm not a scholar in this area. I'm a psychiatrist. That's why I speak about trauma and I speak about the development of empathy. I'm not an expert on matters of race and race relations. That's a different field of study. So I'll just say a few things and then I'll leave the rest to the experts. I'm originally from a majority Black country, and in a country like the US, where Black people are minoritized, it often casts this impression that all Black people are the same, that we're all of one mind. And so in a country like the one I come from, where it's majority Black people are just individuals. Their day-to-day choices are not seen through the lens of race. We're not expected to kind of all be one or to have one mind. That's a phenomenon that exists in places where there's minoritization happening. So even though the police officers were Black, they're individuals making their own decisions. All Black people are not the same. The other thing that I'll mention is from a book called Caste, which is written by Isabel Wilkerson. And in her book, she writes very eloquently about this dynamic. In her book, she speaks about how a social caste system, like the one that exists in the US, with white individuals at the top, brown individuals in the middle, and Black people at the bottom of the caste system, inherently creates some complex behaviors, many of them designed to have proximity to the desired caste. This could be as simple as proximity by physical appearance. So lighter skin tones, different hair, and different facial features. But this need to have proximity to the desired caste also plays out within positions of power. Isabel Wilkerson writes in her book, as people elbow for position, the greatest tensions arise between those adjacent to one another, up and down the ladder. And she also writes, the caste system thrives on dissension and inequality, envy and false rivalries that build up in a world of perceived scarcity. The caste system has historically rewarded snitches and sellouts among the lowest caste, as with the slave drivers on Southern plantations. Lastly, she says in that chapter, the enforcers of caste come in every color, creed, and gender. One does not have to be the dominant class. One does not have to be in the dominant caste to do its bidding. In fact, the most potent instrument of the caste system is a sentinel at every rung whose identity forswears any accusation of discrimination and helps to keep the caste system humming. So those are the three things that I wanted to talk about today. And those are some of my thoughts. I'm curious to know what some of your thoughts are regarding this recent incident. But I'll end my show there for today. Join me again next time on Black Mental Health Matters. And of course, if you like listening to my podcast, you can leave me a positive review on your podcasting platform. You can just rate and review my podcast. Have a great week. And let me know what you think. Drop me a message on Instagram or Facebook. And have a great week. Bye.